I'm Bill Tody, retired Navy captain. I did 26 years active duty and retired in 2006. I'm kind of spooked a little bit today because I do this World War II podcast. It's called the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War, and we're doing quite well. We just passed 7 million views, so we try to keep World War II history alive, at least in the Pacific. That's what we focus on. And today I recorded an episode with historian James Scott, and I went back, and sure enough, you got his book back there. Yesterday, we recorded an episode called Race of Aces about Dick Bong, and I look up and I see Dick Bong's book over here. And today we're talking about Hap Arnold, and I look up and here's Hap Arnold's book, and so I'm being spooked by the books on your shelves that are haunting me. We good?
That's okay.
All right. So my talk today is what I call the forgotten 9/11. And I'll talk later about why I call it the forgotten 9/11. But, you can probably get an idea. I've been asked to do a couple of talks over the years, and they say, oh, you weren't affected by 9/11. Yeah, great. Let's like to book you to talk. And I say, okay, I was in the Pentagon. Oh, you were in the Pentagon? Oh, well, let's see if we can find somebody else. We want somebody from New York, right? People not only forget that we're affected in the Pentagon and the DC area, but I even had one person say to me, well, you guys were all in the military, so you're paid to die. Okay? Right? It's not what we're paid to do. But that's how obtuse and stupid some people can be. So I appreciate any opportunity to talk about 9/11, the Pentagon. So as you know, on that day, 3,408 people went to work in New York and DC that did not come home, didn't ever see their families again, they just disappeared in most cases. And that number did include several of my friends. And it almost included me. I was on active duty. It was a bright, warm September morning, unseasonably warm. At the time, I was working in the office of the Vice Chief of Naval Operations, the number 2 admiral in the Pentagon. His name was Admiral Bill Fallon. I was in his office, which is on the 4th deck of the Pentagon, in the E ring, which is the outermost ring. On watch as the battle captain in the Navy Command Center that day was a Naval Academy classmate of mine named Jerry DeCanto. We were both brand new minted captains. I just pinned on our Eagles within less than a year prior to that day. Jerry was not only a classmate at the academy, but he was a fellow physics major. So we had most of our major physics major classes together, but I hadn't seen him since we graduated. Until we ran into each other in the passageway in the Pentagon a few weeks before 9/11, Jerry had just reported for duty. And we said, we got to catch up, get some coffee. Yep, that was what we agreed to do. Never happened. So he was a great guy. I'll talk about him later. Also on watch in the Navy Command Center was another friend of mine, Commander Pat Dunn. Pat and I were in a study group together on the Navy staff. I describe Pat as one of the least aggressive personalities in a very aggressive group of personalities in this Navy study group, these Navy and Marine officers that were in this group. Pat's wife, Stephanie, was pregnant with their first child at the time. It was a normal day until 8:46 a.m. Now, we always kept the TV on, CNN, in the office. It was one of those old-fashioned, cathode ray tube TVs hung on a pillar in the ceiling, and it was always on CNN because something was going on in the world almost every day, and CNN usually had the story before we did. And so it was good to keep CNN on. And of course, the first thing we saw, I remember I was at my desk and our chief yeoman yelled, "Oh my God, look at that." And looked up and saw the first Twin Tower smoking. That was around 8:46. Then, I forgot to see. Here's where my office was. I'm just going to go back a bit. There's my classmate, Jerry DeCanto, and my friend, Pat Dunn. And that was 8:46, right? And then at 9:03, the second tower was hit, as everybody knows. And at that point, we were suspicious. I remember hearing a moronic CNN reporter say it must have been a navigational error on the first tower, right? And anybody who's ever flown an airplane, and I used to be a private pilot, I wasn't a P-3 pilot, knows that you can't fly into that building on a clear sunny day by navigational error. We knew it was intentional. So on the first one, the second one confirmed that this was a major terrorist attack. We had some early reports from the Navy Command Center that at least one more plane had been hijacked, this one out of Dulles Airport, and that it had turned around and it was flying back towards DC. Then the reports went dark. Having been a pilot, having flown around, I'm thinking, okay, New York, two easy to see targets. Each of them have about 20,000 people in them. What's another easy to see target in the DC area that has 20? Oh, the Pentagon. And I said it out loud in the office. It was a stupid thing to do, but it was the only building that had that many people in the DC area. And people just, the Admiral Secretary in particular, immediately started freaking out. And I regretted saying it. And, it's one of those things where, you just don't know how things are going to unfold. You think you're wrong, but there's a chance you're not wrong. Even if you believe it, what are you going to do about it? We're going to evacuate the Pentagon when the nation's under attack? That's not going to happen. So, for some reason, I felt compelled to go down and visit my friend Jerry DeCanto in the Navy Command Center and say, hey, what's going on? We're not getting any reports. The CNO and the vice chief are in a meeting. We need to be feeding them reports. What's going on? And to my great fortune, another captain who was in the office there with me, named Doug Crowder, said, chill. Words to that effect. Give them some time. They're busy. They'll give us a report when they get it. I was just trying to help, but Doug Crowder ended up saving my life. So we'd been told the plane was inbound. As I said, my office was here. The Navy Command Center was right about there. And in fact, the airplane was inbound. As it turns out, these guys had been trained to do a few things in this airplane, but they couldn't bleed off altitude fast enough. So he came in towards the Pentagon. He was too high, too hot. He had to circle around, bleed altitude, and then come back in that direction. So who knows where he would have hit if he had a glide slope indicator or something to tell him to come in at a lower altitude. Who knows where the plane would have struck? But as it turns out, that's where it struck, right there. Again, I'm on this side. I'm about 100 yards away. And so when we could hear a plane at full throttle, but that's not by itself unusual because the Pentagon's right next to Reagan Airport. You hear planes at full throttle all the time. But what happens is they go to full throttle, and as they climb, take off and climb, they get quieter. This one was at full throttle, but it was getting louder. But I don't think we heard it for more than 10 or 15 seconds before the impact. When the plane impacted, you could feel the building shake, vibrate. It wasn't like the World Trade Center. It's not built up. It's low and made out of stone. So as everybody knows now, the wings sheared off and it penetrated. I'll show a map later as to how it penetrated. But I remember hearing the sound, but the sound didn't come from the outside like I expected it to. The sound was reverberating down the passageways, the explosion sound. And then the passageways filled up with smoke. So there's a few Navy guys in here. You know that in the Navy, when you're on a ship at sea and you have a casualty, you can't call the fire department. You are the fire department. So you're trained on how to respond to the casualty. And I did what any Navy damage control officer would do. I ran towards the noise, right? And so initially, again, the plane hit there. So my initial run was on the fourth deck, down the E-ring, and through the smoke. I couldn't see much. I could see a little bit, couldn't see much. When I turned the corner, I saw something I shouldn't have seen: daylight. There was a hole in the building. And I said, okay, I can't see where I'm going, but I know there's not supposed to be sun. So I guess I better go back the way I came. So I ran back the way I came, then ran down the staircase by the mall entrance, and then ran towards the point of impact from the outside. So that's kind of when everything starts to reveal to me. And as I approached this point of impact, I could see a white fuselage, aluminum with a red A on it, with American Airlines. There were plane parts scattered all over the place. There was a landing gear to the left. Most of it was on fire. And again, this is kind of the scene as it unfolded there. Area of impact. This is where I ran out. This is Route 28. That's going to play a major role later. And here's the interesting part. There happened to be an ABC News camera crewman. He was actually kind of where I ran out of the building, trying to cover. The Secretary of Defense was going to come out and make some comments or something like that. So he'd been standing there, and he ran around. He was here, ran around kind of with me. I didn't know this at the time. In fact, I didn't learn any of this until 2016. But he was filming the whole time. And here is a screen grab that he did from his video, and that's me. So he was behind me, I guess. And if you say, how do you know that's you? The only guy in khakis over there. Well, that's me, right? So that's when I turned around later and was running the opposite direction. And the reason this is important, it kind of became important, is because I was one of the few guys from this video who they could identify from that day. And because of that, anytime a documentary is done about the Pentagon, I'm in it, because they could show the video of that day from the outside, the only video that exists, and there's one guy they could identify in the video. So they keep asking me to do it. Right about this point, and it was really about this point, I grabbed my cell phone. I said, I got to call home and tell her that I'm still alive. Yeah, she wasn't home. She was at the gym. But I left a voicemail on our old answering machine, antiquated now, right? You remember those things, right? And the problem was the time sync wasn't very good. So she didn't know if I left the voicemail before the plane hit or after the plane hit. And because I tried calling out, cell phone circuits here were jammed. I couldn't get a call out. And so I think it was maybe 4 hours before she knew that I was alive when I finally did get a signal. So when I ran over here, you see there's a fire truck over here. So the first thing I see is there's somebody slumped down in the fire truck. And I said, oh no. And the fire truck was on fire, okay? You'll see in the video later, the fire truck on fire. And so I thought this guy might be dead. And so I opened the fire truck door and I grab him, thinking I'm going to pull him out. And as I grab him, he kind of alerts and sits up. And it turns out he was on the radio, right? Because of the noise. It was terrific cacophony, right? Horrible noise of exploding and burning. There were secondary explosions going on. And he was trying to get down and get quiet so he can call for, he was a Fort Myer federal firefighter trying to get more people to come down. And his name was, I didn't know, I never met the dude until 2016. Here's the fire truck on fire. When I was called up to Maine to film the very first documentary that was done about the Pentagon, they had found him and they put us in the same hotel at the same time, knowing that we were those two guys, but they didn't tell us each other about the other one. And they let us discover each other in the hotel bar that night. And his name is Alan Wallace. He's a great friend to this day. He calls me every couple of months to make sure I'm okay. And he goes around and he does these kind of talks like every month. He's helping keep this story alive, and I'm very grateful to Alan for his friendship all of these years, even though I only met him in 2016 when we did that documentary. So, as I said, I'd show you where the plane hit. So this is the point of entry in the plane. This is the Navy Command Center. And you say, wow, this is the part that was clear cut. Basically, all the pillars, the stanchions, as we call them in the Navy, they were all taken out by the plane. Punched a hole, they call it the punch-out hole, with the nose. Actually, as it disintegrated, it went backwards, so it went inside out. So the nose of the airplane ended up here, then the next segment here, then the next segment here, so on and so forth. And the tail of the airplane is because the nose was pushing a hole, so it was kind of cascading this hole through the building. So it was actually the tail of the airplane that ended up down here. But this entire area, the concussion of the blast, the fire, everybody was killed. And so, that's kind of the way it took everything out. After I realized that Alan Wallace, who I didn't know who Alan Wallace was still alive, there was a door right here, and smoke was coming out of the door. The fire truck was right about here, and I thought I saw movement inside the door, but I couldn't tell because there's black smoke kind of coming out, and so ran in the door, and I tripped over somebody. Couldn't see them. Was holding my breath, but I knew that it was a person. So I tried to lift. It was a her. Tried to lift her. Couldn't lift her. Couldn't hold my breath any longer. Ran back out, and a bunch of guys, Army guys, ran back in with me, and we kind of half carried. Three of us half carried. This is a photo that's later. That isn't what's happening in this image, but it was later. Half carried, half dragged this woman out, and laid her on the grass, maybe 20, 30 yards, as far as we could. Basically, sheets of her skin was coming off in our hands, and we didn't think we should carry her any farther the way we were carrying her, so we laid her down on the grass. In the video I'm going to show you later, there's a group of people who put her on a backboard and move her to the side of Route 28, and in that video you'll see Secretary Rumsfeld is one of those people that are carrying her to the side of what he's doing. And his staff is going crazy looking for him, wondering if he'd been killed. The nation's under attack. What the heck is the Secretary of Defense doing outside helping people basically anybody could have. The 9/11 tourist could have helped with that bodyboard. Rumsfeld needed to be inside the National Military Command Center. People started yelling at him, "Get inside, they're calling for you." And he finally did. But that was the first lady. Then, not too long after that, ran back down, and we came across another guy. And this guy, I don't know how he got out of the building. We didn't bring him out. I used to know, but I've forgotten. His name, turns out, was Juan Cruz. I didn't know this at the time. And Juan was burned over every visible inch of his body. Even his corneas were burned white. It was really tough. And he was screaming, as you can imagine. There were secondary explosions going on here. We wanted to get him away from the building. Every time we tried touching him, he'd start screaming. The other picture you saw of me, where you could see me more clearly, what I'm actually doing is going up, because this is around the time the first ambulance showed up. I'm asking for a backboard. So we bring the backboard down to Juan and put him on. That's what we're doing here, is putting him on the backboard so that we can carry him out in a way that we hope would be less painful. And so that was Juan. And so we did carry him to the side of Route 28 and put him down there. And so, let's see. As we put Juan down, there was, like I said, the first ambulance crew was there. I noticed the first lady that we carried out, that we left in a different spot, right, was laying there on the grass near Route 28, and nobody was with her. She was by herself. And so one of the ambulance crew guys said, here's an oxygen bottle and an IV bag. Do you know how to do this? And a decade earlier, I'd gone to EMT school as part of my Navy training. So I said, I think so. I knew how to put the oxygen bottle on, but I had a hard time with a woman that badly burned with the IV. Another Navy guy in khakis came over with this blue vest that said Pentagon physician. And I said, hallelujah, you can run this line. I can't get it done. And it turns out he was a dentist, Navy dentist. And he was supposed to establish a triage station. That was his job. So he couldn't get this IV line run any better than I could. And, we ended up not being able to do that. But he ran away trying to get somebody who might be able to do that. And he never came back. And so I could see that she was struggling to speak. So I put my ear down next to her. And I was asked a question that I never anticipating ever having to answer. And that was, she said, "Doctor, am I going to die?" And I didn't think about it at the time. She was confusing the two Navy guys, the one that with the vest that said Pentagon physician with me, the one who didn't say Pentagon physician. And I didn't figure that out until much later, that's why she mistook me that way. And I don't know, it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do, but I said, "What's your name?" She said, "Antoinette." I said, "No, Antoinette, you're not going to die. We've got a helicopter coming. We're going to put you on it." I'd heard that from the EMT guys that the medevac copter was inbound. So I ended up staying with her until the helicopter did show up, and we carried her on another backboard to the helicopter. That's me out of breath on the left. Yeah. It was a combination of not being as in good shape as I should have been and having breathed that smoke. And so that's that. All right, so where are we? The rest of the day, really, after we got that first wave of people out of the building, we tried to go back in and do what we could, but it was really not safe. We had no gear. Firefighters were starting to arrive. And more to the point, there was a deputy sheriff, armed, standing in front of the door we'd been going in, not letting anybody go back in. One of the soldiers that came out had said there's a bunch of people inside the doorway about 20, 30 feet on the ground, trapped behind a door. And we argued and screamed that we should be let back in to get these people. But it had been 30 minutes. And if they were coming out, they'd been out. We had no gear. The firefighters, that was their job at that point. There was a really ugly exchange between the sergeant major of the Army, the actual sergeant major of the Army. Remember, this is the Pentagon. And that deputy sheriff to let us, we're not leaving any of our people behind. And he would not let us in. And the sheriff was actually making the right call. This is around that time when we were having that fight. So, as it turns out, no other rescues were going to happen that day. Everybody that had been rescued that day were rescued not by professional rescuers, but by people who just happened to be on the scene when the plane hit. And for a building like the Pentagon, you need to have the right kind of people trained and ready for something like that, because it took a long time, 20 minutes at least, for the fire department to arrive and the ambulances to arrive. And by that time, everybody that could be rescued had already been rescued, and everybody that was left in the building was beyond rescuing. And so that became one of the lessons, for me anyway, on 9/11. I actually stayed. Don't ask me why I stayed. There were hundreds of us that stayed throughout the day, thinking that sooner or later there was going to be something that we could do. We did silly things, not so silly, I guess. Things like put up shelters for the firefighters to spray cool down as they circled out. We started helping with the exchange of the Scott air packs, the air packs that the firefighters use. We were just labor. We had privates. I was a '06, I was a captain. We had colonel, we had runners because, like I said, the cell phones didn't work, and all the different fire departments. Fire departments came down from as far away as Delaware, and they were all on different circuits. So we set up like Civil War. We set up runners to pass messages from one group to another. This was in theory, the Fairfax County Firefight EMS was supposed to be in charge, but this was bigger than anybody had ever imagined. And they just didn't have the capability to run a catastrophe, a casualty this big. There was Secret Service there. There was, you know, there was multi-agency, and just there wasn't the comms systems available to do that. Finally, I started running off of adrenaline at about 8 or 9 that night. I borrowed a cell phone because my cell phone battery was dead by this time, and called home and said, 395, the freeway that drives past the Pentagon, had been shut down. There was a roadblock a couple miles south. I said, just drive north. My mother and sister had shown up by this time at our house with my wife. Drive north as far as you can go. I'll start walking south. Somehow we'll find each other. And one of the funny stories, not much funny from that day, is I started walking south on the freeway in the northbound lane because I knew they'd be coming north. And there was a sheriff there, there's a state highway patrolman there. And he had parked with his lights going. And I'm walking like, I'm sure I looked like a crazy man. And he says, hey, can I give you a ride somewhere? And he said, did you come out of there? And I said, yeah. Can you give a ride somewhere? I said, no, if I get in my car, my wife will never find me. This is how out of it I was, right? And so the dude lets me continue walking south in the northbound lane, but he turns his car around, and now he's driving south in the northbound lane behind me, creeping, right? As I'm walking. It's like, you can't make this stuff up. And, but God bless him. He was worried about me, and by some miracle, she found me. They found me. And so they picked me up and drove me home. Now, here's one of those interesting side stories. So I get home that night, and I had been working with I was commanding officer of the nuclear fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis in my prior tour before I got transferred to the Pentagon. And I had been working with the survivors of the World War II cruiser USS Indianapolis for, at this point, 2 years or so on the exoneration of their captain. And so I started getting calls from them that night. And one of them calls up and says, Bill, just calling to make sure you're okay. Yeah, I'm okay. I appreciate you calling. He said, yeah, I don't know if you realize it, but you got hit by a kamikaze just like us. You got too close to us, and you were forced to share our fate. And it did not occur to me until that moment that what they did was the same thing that the Japanese had been doing during World War II. They didn't invent this tactic. They were just better students of history than we were. They were just copying the Japanese and turning airliners into kamikaze airplanes. How brilliant, right? I hate to say that, but it is smart. And we didn't, somebody called it a failure of imagination. We certainly weren't smart enough to see that coming. And that's their ship. And I got a call from probably 18 or 19 of them that night. It was just so wonderful of them to do that. The only thing I would say is he was wrong about one thing. It wasn't just we that got hit by the kamikaze. It was all of America that got hit by 4 kamikazes that night. And we can't, we can't forget that. And we can't underestimate the cunning of our enemies. And that's another lesson from this. What I learned is that even if we Americans fail to remember history, our enemies won't. And I said at the beginning of this that this is the forgotten 9/11, and I kind of explained why. If I run into people, I talk about, being affected by 9/11, the immediate assumption is I was in New York, and the people in New York suffered mightily, and they deserve all of the attention they get. The last documentary that was done about 9/11 was the National Geographic one that was released last year. It was a 6-part special called 9/11 One Day in America. And if you've seen it, you'll see that 6 hours devoted to 9/11, 6 minutes on the Pentagon. And I'm the only one from the Pentagon they talk to. And just, I get that New York deserves a lot of the attention, but not 6 minutes out of 6 hours. The Pentagon deserves more attention than that. And so that does kind of, it's why I keep beating the table whenever I say it. I saw some horrific things that day and the days that followed. On September 12th, I was put in charge of the Navy's recovery effort because my job essentially wasn't as important as a job that never needed to be done before. We in the Navy call them damage control assistant. The CNO never needed a damage control assistant before, but we needed one on September 12th. So I became the CNO's DCA. Then, 3 days, it took 3 days to put the fires out. The FBI wouldn't allow any bodies to be removed because they considered a crime scene. But one of the first things that happened after the fires went out is the FBI asked me to escort them in and show them where the Navy Command Center had been. And so I had the not too fun task of going in there with some bodies I recognized and some didn't look like bodies anymore. But yeah, the airline seats were there and everything else you could imagine. Anything that didn't burn was still there. So my classmate Jerry DeCanto didn't survive. My friend Pat Dunn didn't survive. And it wasn't until the first documentary came out in 2016 that his widow, Stephanie, reconnected with us through the documentary. And then Karen and I got to go to visit with them. And I got to meet his daughter, who was born after Pat died, and spend a little bit of time telling her what his dad was like. The badly burned man that was on the ground, I didn't know who he was. He survived. Juan Cruz. That's great news that he survived. USA Today tried to reconnect us after they discovered a photograph of me on the ground next to him a year after, so September 11th, 2002, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it because I thought he died. I honestly did. I thought he died, and that one bottle of oxygen that we had, I put it on Antoinette because I didn't think he had any chance of surviving. And Antoinette did die. And so she died in the burn unit maybe a week after we, got her on that helicopter. And, and that was a horrible story. I live every day with the memory of telling her that she was going to be okay when she wasn't. And was that the right thing to tell her? I don't know. But I'm told that she never regained consciousness after she went into the burn unit. And so it is what it is. You can't change history. But as bad as that story is, let me tell you a story about a Navy chief from the Navy staff named Brown. Chief Brown would have been in the Navy Command Center that day, except he took off that day to bring his son onto the airport to go on a field trip. His son's name was Bernard. Bernard was getting on a plane to fly to California to go on a field trip. Bernard was 11 years old. Bernard was on American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon. The dad should have died. He lived. The son shouldn't have been on that plane. He died. And so it's a lot of horrible stories that just people don't know because nobody talks about the Pentagon, right? And so that's kind of sad to me. Interestingly, when somebody does talk to me or ask me about 9/11, it's usually one of the crazies, one of the conspiracy theorists who say that we attacked ourselves with cruise missiles. And these people are trying to tell a guy who carried cruise missiles for over 10 years on submarines what a cruise missile looks like when they've never seen one. And, when I saw the airplane, and I'm not a violent guy, but if you want to make me crazy, tell me that There wasn't an airplane that hit the building when I saw the airplane, right? And, the conversation will end real fast. And she's been with me when some people have brought that up, and those conversations don't go well. Um, so for 22 years, my sister, right after 9/11, who is a Christian, said to me, God spared you for a reason. And I got to tell you, that made me angry, right? When I thought about, Bernard Brown and Antoinette and all these people, the notion that God picked and chose who would live and die that day just made me angry. The only way I could get past the thought of what happened was to acknowledge the fact that there was objective evil in this world, not subjective evil, but objective evil. And that notion carried me through those 22 years. I wasn't a Christian. I didn't believe her when she said that God spared me. But something happened to me last year. I don't know what it was. She doesn't know. She still can't figure it out. But God hit me beside the head with a 2x4 and woke me up and said, you need to understand that what this evil is, it's not objective evil. It's an absence of me that caused these things to happen. Because those people thought that they were doing this for God. Thing is that those people didn't know Jesus and they were worshiping the wrong God. And that's one of the many revelations I've had in the last year. And since then, I've devoted pretty much all of my time in trying to help people understand God's purpose in this world and God's presence. And starting September 9th, a couple of weeks, I'm going to be leading a Christian small group for veterans. If anybody's interested, talk to me afterwards, because that is what I'm really, really inspired to do these days. And one footnote before I cut to the little short film clip I have is that on September 11th, there was a Catholic priest that walked down from his parish in Arlington to the Pentagon area. I wasn't Catholic then, I'm not Catholic now, but he wanted to get in and see what he could do. And the security guards, the Pentagon security folks, wouldn't let him in. They said to him, medical personnel only. And I happened to be standing there when he said this. And I told the security guard, let him in. I think we have more need for priests right now than we do doctors. Because this was after we realized that nobody else was coming out of that building. And so he came in and he started administering last rites to those that asked for it. And this is a photograph of him, young priest. And I tried to reconnect with him a couple of times and can't find him. But I was with him for much of that day. And, after he gave up trying to administer last rites to the people on the ground, he went just and basically did it to the whole building. And that was one of the most poignant moments of the day. And, I'll never forget that. So it's on September 11, 2001, as I said, 3,408 people went to work and didn't come home. People who never again saw their families. So let's remember September 11th. But as importantly, let's remember September 12th. Because on September 12th, we came together as Americans in a way that hadn't happened since Pearl Harbor. We weren't Democrats and Republicans. We weren't right and left. We weren't bifurcated. We weren't extremes. We were Americans. We weren't white or black or Asian or Hispanic. We were all Americans. And let's hope that it won't take another 9/11 to remind us of that fact. It's not an ephemeral hope. I really believe it can happen if we get the right people in charge, but it's going to take all of us to move us in that direction. Thank you very much.